In early 1995, a hiker vanished in the secluded mountains of Central Oregon. Following a series of reported sightings, some residents of the isolated nearby community began to suspect the missing man had fallen victim to a rare animal-transmitted illness, known as Hill's fever. The indigenous tribes who once inhabited the region had their own name for it. It was known as the Face of the Wolf. The story opens with Grady taking his son, Blake, on a hunting trip. Blake, however, appears distracted and uninterested, ignoring his father's instructions. Frustrated, Grady warns him that while the wilderness is beautiful, it is also dangerous. He emphasizes that survival depends on knowing how to act in critical situations, reminding Blake that life can change in an instant, and that our end is always nearby. As Grady speaks, Blake suddenly notices something in the distance. When Grady turns to look, he spots a deer. Grady quietly prepares to take the shot but loses sight of the animal. He calls out to Blake, only to discover his son has vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, Blake moves to a different location to get a clearer view. He waits for the deer to reappear, but instead, he spots a strange creature that vanishes almost immediately. Blake tries to locate it again but hears growling in the distance. Fear sets in as he stands up and slowly steps backward, the sounds of chittering and growling growing louder around him. Suddenly, Grady arrives and scolds him for not following instructions. Blake explains he was only trying to get a better shot at the deer. Grady lets it go, but just then, rustling and chittering noises echo around them. Sensing danger, Grady scans the area through his scope, but sees nothing. Alarmed, he tells Blake to climb into the deer blind. Inside the blind, Grady positions himself, aiming his gun at the door as the sound of something climbing the ladder reaches them. The creature pauses, and for a moment, there's silence. Then, it begins slamming against the door, trying to break in. It stops again, only to reappear moments later, attempting to attack from behind. Before it can strike, the sound of an animal distracts it, and the creature leaps down, rushing off to hunt its new prey. Grady looks out and sees a mutilated deer in the distance. Scanning the area, he spots the creature and fires a shot, but it escapes into the woods. Its howl echoes through the trees before fading away. Blake, shaken, asks what it was. Grady hesitates, then claims it was a bear. That night, Grady contacts his friend Dan over the radio, explaining that he saw the face of the wolf and nearly shot it. Dan questions why Grady is so determined to pursue something that clearly doesn't want to be found. Grady responds by recounting how the creature had come after his son while they were hunting by the river. He insists that he's going to hunt it down and demands Dan join him, asking if he doesn't want to protect his own son. 30 years later, Blake is now married to Charlotte, and they have a daughter named Ginger. Blake informs Charlotte that he's received a letter officially declaring his father, Grady, deceased. Charlotte expresses her sympathy and asks how he's feeling. Blake admits that while they had expected the letter eventually, it's still a shock. Ginger asks if he's sad, and Blake admits he is, adding that he wishes he had known his father better. He explains that Grady always made him feel afraid, so he left home as soon as he could. The next day, Blake asks Charlotte if she's happy. When she says yes, he questions why he's asking. Blake confesses that receiving the letter made him realize how little time they have with the people they love, and that Charlotte and Ginger are the only family he has left. He suggests they all go to Oregon with him to pack up his father's belongings and spend the summer there, emphasizing that it would be good for them as a family. Charlotte hesitates, saying she can't just leave work. Blake counters, saying that she can work remotely and use the time to reconnect with Ginger. Charlotte expresses doubt about her ability to bond with Ginger, feeling that their daughter relates more to Blake. Blake reassures her, telling her she's an incredible mother. Next, the family is on their way to Blake's father's house, enjoying the journey. As they drive, Blake notices 2 roads ahead and brings the truck to a stop. Confused, he pulls out his phone to check the map, but realizes they have no signal. Ginger looks around and spots a man in a nearby treehouse, pointing him out to Blake. The man approaches and asks where they're headed. Blake explains they're trying to find his father's farm. The man asks who his father is, and when Blake says Grady, the man responds that Blake has been gone a long time. Blake, puzzled, asks if they know each other, and the man introduces himself as Derek, Dan's son. Blake remembers him and greets him warmly. Derek mentions that not many people live in the area anymore. Blake insists they're on the right path, but Derek explains that the driveway now belongs to him, and that the usual road to Grady's place is blocked. He offers to guide them there and help them settle in. Derek gets into the car, and Blake introduces him to Charlotte and Ginger. As they continue toward the farm, Derek tells Blake there are things he'll need to come to terms with up here. Charlotte responds confidently, saying they're tough people. Derek turns to her and remarks that she doesn't seem tough, but that it's a good thing because it means she's had a good life. He then asks Blake what he does for a living. Blake admits he's a writer currently between jobs, while Charlotte adds that she's a journalist. Derek smiles and says he bets Blake looks at his family every day and wonders how he got so lucky to have such a smart and beautiful family. Blake agrees, smiling in return. Suddenly, the werewolf appears on the road, causing Blake to swerve and lose control of the truck. It crashes into a ditch, slamming against a tree and leaving them stuck. When Blake regains consciousness, he checks on Charlotte and Ginger, who assure him they're unharmed. Derek opens the door but collapses to the ground. Blake quickly instructs Ginger to climb out through the window. As Ginger and Charlotte scramble onto the truck, a low, guttural growl echoes around them. Blake glances into the rearview mirror and sees the werewolf approaching. He struggles to shut the door just as the creature lunges, but it smashes through the window. Blake watches in horror as the werewolf drags Derek away. Blake and his family flee, realizing they're close to his father's house. As they spot it, the werewolf growls behind them, closing in fast. They sprint toward the house, barely making it inside before the beast reaches them. The werewolf slams against the door, trying to break through, but after several attempts, it finally retreats. Blake grabs a flashlight and heads to the basement to turn on the electricity. As he pulls the lever, the generator rumbles to life, and the lights flicker on. Blake returns to his family, where a frightened Ginger tells him she wants to go home. He gently reassures her they will, but they can't leave until morning. Later, Blake apologizes to Ginger, admitting he failed to protect her and put her through something terrifying. He expresses his fear of leaving a lasting mark on her and reflects on how parents sometimes become the source of their children's scars. He then turns to Charlotte, who asks what the creature was. Blake admits it sounded like an animal, but stood on 2 feet like a person. He reinforces the door with a cupboard, and when Charlotte questions if it will hold, he replies uncertainly, suggesting they try calling for help. Blake turns on his father's radio and attempts to make contact, but no one responds. After a while, he notices a strange smell and follows it to a room, where he finds flesh hanging inside. Meanwhile, Charlotte takes over the radio, trying to reach someone. Blake returns, claiming he found some of his father's jerky to eat. As he chews, his jaw begins to hurt, and he assumes it's from hitting the steering wheel during the crash. However, to his shock, one of his teeth breaks and falls out. Charlotte rushes to check on him and notices a deep cut on his arm. She pours hydrogen peroxide on the wound, causing him to wince. Blake insists he must have cut it on the truck's window, but Charlotte hesitates, saying it doesn't look like a glass injury. She bandages the wound, and Blake thanks her, asking her to keep trying the radio. Later, while drinking water, Blake hears a thumping sound and becomes alert. Grabbing a hammer, he cautiously heads upstairs, following the noise to a room. He opens the door and steps inside, realizing the sound is coming from a wardrobe. When he opens it, he finds nothing inside but a spider crawling around. Suddenly he feels dizzy, his breathing grows rapid, and he struggles to regain his composure. As he calms down, he hears distant howling from outside. Blake returns to Charlotte and Ginger, but hears footsteps approaching. He signals Charlotte to stay quiet and moves toward the window, sniffing the air as someone passes by outside. Charlotte watches in shock, unsettled by his odd behavior. Blake stops near the door, but suddenly the werewolf grabs his leg, trying to drag him out. Charlotte quickly picks up the hammer and strikes the creature, forcing it to let go. Blake grunts in pain and moves away from the door before losing consciousness. When he wakes up later, Blake searches for his wife and daughter. He can only hear Charlotte's voice, faint and unclear, leaving him disoriented and alarmed. Blake follows the faint sound of Charlotte's voice and makes his way to the basement, where he finds Ginger sleeping and Charlotte desperately trying to make contact on the radio. Her voice sounds distorted to him, and she pleads for help, growing increasingly frustrated when no one responds. In a moment of anger, she throws the microphone aside. Suddenly, she hears Blake wheezing and turns to find him standing in the shadows behind her. He steps into the light, attempting to speak, but his words are garbled and unclear. Charlotte, visibly shaken, tells him how worried she is but admits she doesn't know what to do. Blake loses control and urinates on himself, prompting Charlotte to gently guide him upstairs. Once upstairs, Charlotte hands him a pen and paper, asking if he can write down what's wrong. Blake struggles to grip the pen but eventually manages to scrawl the word, dying. Charlotte quickly reassures him, insisting he's just sick and they'll find a way to help him. She tells him firmly that he's going to get better because she and Ginger need him, adding that she loves him. However, it becomes clear that Blake can't hear her clearly, and his vision is distorted. He asks Charlotte what's happening, admitting he can't understand her, while she also struggles to comprehend his words. Ginger, confused and scared, asks what's happening to him. Charlotte calls her over and explains that Daddy isn't feeling well, but assures her they'll take him to the doctor in the morning. Ginger asks Blake directly if he's sick, but before he can respond, he notices blood on his hand. Charlotte quickly rolls up his sleeve to check his arm, telling Ginger to go to the next room. When she removes the bandage, she's horrified by the state of his wound. Suddenly, Blake stands up, grunting, and moves aside before frantically scratching his arm. Charlotte watches in horror as he begins to devour his own flesh, his teeth loosening and falling out as he chews. He stops abruptly, looks at Charlotte, who is frozen in fear, and without a word, quietly walks away. Charlotte quietly moves to the window and spots a car outside. Without hesitation, she rushes to the basement to grab the keys and a battery. The three of them approach the car, and Charlotte helps Blake into the back seat. As she secures Ginger inside, a distant howl echoes through the night. Charlotte opens the hood to jumpstart the car, while Ginger watches her father, who has begun to transform. Charlotte hurries back to the driver's seat, turns the key, and the engine whirs but fails to start. After several attempts, the car finally roars to life. She quickly disconnects the battery and returns to the car. But before they can leave, the werewolf suddenly appears on the hood. It smashes the windshield and breaks the gear lever. Desperate, Charlotte attacks it with a knife, and the three of them escape the car, running toward a greenhouse. The werewolf chases them, but they manage to climb onto the greenhouse roof, narrowly escaping its reach. The creature enters the greenhouse, and as it jumps repeatedly, the tent pins begin to loosen. The werewolf makes several cuts on the tent with its claws, and in a moment of panic, Ginger slips and hangs from a tier. They pull her up just in time. Blake signals Charlotte and Ginger to go to the house, and jumps down to distract the werewolf. Charlotte and Ginger run toward the house, and as Charlotte opens the door, Ginger hears growling in the distance. They quickly enter and shut the door. Ginger tells Charlotte that Daddy is outside and will get hurt. Charlotte explains he was trying to protect them, but just then, they hear huffing outside. Charlotte tells Ginger to stay back, and cautiously approaches the window to check. Ginger asks if it's Daddy, insisting he's sick and needs their help. Despite her fear, Charlotte opens the door for Blake and watches in terror as he steps inside. Ginger approaches him, placing her hand on his forehead, and asks what he's thinking. He tries to speak, and she answers that she was thinking she loves him. She then asks if he can hear her, but he is unable to respond. She softly tells him she loves him so much. As she removes her hand, Blake suddenly starts gasping, his nails falling off, before vomiting blood. Ginger screams in terror as Blake picks up a severed finger, looks up at them, and lunges, cornering Charlotte against a wall. At first, Charlotte is terrified, but she locks eyes with Blake, causing him to unexpectedly calm down and step aside. Just as he opens the door to leave, a werewolf lunges at him, attacking viciously. It pins him to the floor, but Charlotte attacks it, forcing it to turn its attention to her. She quickly locks Ginger in a room and runs, but the werewolf charges at her. Blake intervenes, slamming into the creature. The beast hurls him against the wall and across the hallway before knocking him unconscious. It begins to drag Blake away, but is distracted by Ginger's voice. Charlotte strikes it with an iron rod, and before it can retaliate, Blake lunges at the werewolf, pushing it away. In a horrifying moment, he sinks his teeth into its throat, slaying it. As Blake catches his breath, he notices a tattoo on the werewolf's arm and realizes it was his father. Blake staggers outside and collapses as his transformation continues. His nails crumble, replaced by sharp claws, and he rises as a fully transformed werewolf, his howl piercing the night. Meanwhile, the lights in the house go out. Charlotte cautiously approaches the window and sees Blake fully transformed before he suddenly runs away. As she backs away, a crashing sound startles them. Blake is seen quietly descending the stairs, the creaking wood drawing their attention. Charlotte picks up a knife and moves toward the stairs to investigate, but Blake is nowhere in sight. As she steps back, he is revealed sitting behind Ginger. Charlotte screams and rushes to protect her daughter, striking Blake with the knife. Enraged, he snatches it from her, giving Charlotte and Ginger a chance to escape the house. They hide inside a barn where Charlotte finds a torch and a chain. Moments later, Blake arrives and tries to open the gate. Finding it locked, he begins digging beneath it to squeeze inside, but suddenly stops. The next moment, he is revealed sitting in the darkness right in front of them, his sharp eyes fixed on them. As he moves closer, his leg gets caught in a trap, and Charlotte and Ginger scream in terror, fleeing into the woods. Blake bites off his own leg to free himself and chases after them, his fury growing. Enraged, he leaps onto a rock and lets out a thunderous roar that echoes through the night. Charlotte and Ginger stumble upon Derek's severed hand, and as they look around, Charlotte spots their truck. She searches for Derek's gun, but Ginger warns her that Blake is coming. Charlotte finds the gun, but before they can react, they hear a noise from above the truck. Spotting Blake there, they flee and hide in the deer blind. Blake approaches, climbing the stairs. As he reaches the top, Charlotte aims the gun at him and stands up, hesitating when she sees him. He turns to Ginger, who realizes he's trying to communicate. She tells her mother he wants it to be over. As he opens the gate, Charlotte shoots him. Blake takes his final breaths as Charlotte and Ginger approach. Ginger places her hand on his forehead for a moment before pulling it away. Moments later, Blake slowly passes. As the sun rises, Charlotte and Ginger walk out into the valley near the farm, and the movie ends.